The glass tower shimmered under the Chicago skyline, its sharp edges catching the last orange hues of the setting sun. Inside the top floor of the building, Eleanor Blake closed her laptop with a soft sigh. It had been a long week filled with meetings, numbers, and decisions. As the CEO of one of the most powerful software firms in the city, she was used to late nights and pressure. But today, something felt different. As she stood to leave, her assistant knocked gently and peeked in. "There's a boy outside," she said hesitantly. "He says he's here to meet someone, but he won't say who." Eleanor frowned. "A boy? He's been waiting for over an hour. Quiet, polite, didn't want anything. He's just sitting." Curiosity tugged at her. She stepped out of her office and glanced toward the waiting area. A small boy, maybe 9 years old, sat alone on a bench. He wore a thin hoodie far too light for the November chill. His sneakers were old, soles worn almost flat. A brown paper bag rested in his lap, untouched. Their eyes met for a second. He offered a shy, uncertain smile. Eleanor approached slowly. "Are you lost?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Who are you here to see?" The boy hesitated. "Someone important." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you know their name?" He paused again. "I think he works at night. He cleans." That answer surprised her. The janitorial staff usually arrived after office hours. Most of them were contract workers. Eleanor tried to remember the last time she noticed any of them. She could not. Security moved closer, whispering something into their radios. Before they could step in, the elevator dinged, and out stepped Marcus Hill. He was dressed in his usual gray uniform, pushing a small cart of cleaning supplies. His posture was tired but firm, the lines on his face deep with years of silent labor. The moment he saw the boy, he stopped. His expression shifted. Surprise, concern, then something softer. He walked over and placed a hand on the child's shoulder. "You shouldn't be here, Jason," he said quietly. "I wanted to walk with you," the boy answered, barely above a whisper. Eleanor watched, now fully invested. "Is he your grandson?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. His mother had to leave town on short notice. She asked me to look after him for a few days. I didn't want to call off work." Eleanor studied them closely. Marcus had worked here for years. She remembered approving his renewal contract last year. Nothing unusual had stood out. He was quiet, always on time, never requested anything. She had never seen him without his gloves, never heard him speak more than a few words. Jason clutched the paper bag. "I brought him dinner," he said. The words hit harder than Eleanor expected. She glanced at the time. It was nearly 7:30 p.m. The boy had likely been waiting since before dark, alone in a building filled with strangers. "You should have called someone," Eleanor said gently to Marcus. He nodded, eyes lowered. "Didn't want to trouble anyone." That sentence lingered. She had heard it before, always from people who worked the hardest and asked the least. Eleanor looked down at Jason again. "Are you cold?" "I'm okay," he replied with a small nod, still smiling. She turned back toward her office, but stopped halfway, glancing one more time over her shoulder. Something about this boy, this moment, didn't sit right. Not in a bad way, just incomplete. Later that night, as the building emptied out, and Eleanor stood by the window watching city lights flicker on one by one, she could not shake the image of that paper bag in the boy's lap. And for reasons she could not yet explain, she knew tomorrow would not be just another day. Night had fully settled over Chicago when Eleanor stepped into the parking garage. The air was crisp, filled with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional echo of footsteps on concrete. Her car waited near the exit, but she hesitated before unlocking the door. Instead, she leaned against the driver's side, her eyes scanning the entrance. 15 minutes passed before Marcus emerged, his grandson walking quietly at his side. Jason held onto his backpack with both hands, head lowered, but his steps steady. Marcus pushed his cleaning cart toward the storage room, where he returned it with careful precision. Eleanor watched as they turned toward the street, neither speaking, just moving in sync like it was a familiar routine. Without a sound, she slipped into her car and kept a fair distance behind them. Her mind buzzed with questions she could not ignore. Curiosity was no longer a passing feeling. It was now a quiet urgency pressing against her conscience. They reached the bus stop, where an overhead light flickered weakly. Jason sat on the bench, pulling his sleeves down to cover his fingers. Marcus stood beside him, arms crossed, back slightly hunched. The bus arrived late. They boarded together, and Eleanor followed in her vehicle, navigating slowly through traffic. As the bus snaked its way through dimly lit streets, with each mile, the city's glow faded. Towering buildings gave way to cracked sidewalks and graffiti-covered walls. Convenience stores with metal shutters lined the roads, and streetlights grew farther apart. The bus rolled through neighborhoods that rarely made it into company reports or polished presentations. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel, a sinking feeling spreading through her chest. The vehicle finally halted near a sagging fence. Marcus and Jason stepped off, walking past rows of run-down houses and broken porches. They turned down an alley where overhead cables dangled like forgotten wires. She parked discreetly and followed, on foot, staying far enough to remain unseen but close enough to observe. They stopped at a rusted metal gate, beyond which stood a small structure that barely resembled a home. Paint peeled from its surface, and the windows were covered with sheets instead of curtains. Jason fumbled with a key, opened the door, and flicked on a weak bulb hanging from the ceiling. From the sidewalk, Eleanor could see just enough to understand. The space inside was cramped. A small table sat unevenly against the wall. The refrigerator, bore-dense, and a torn blanket was draped over a worn-out couch. Jason placed the backpack on the floor and walked into a corner where a thin mattress lay directly on the wood. Eleanor stood frozen. This was where Marcus lived, after cleaning corporate floors for over a decade. This was where he returned each night after others had gone home to comfort. It was not just humbling, it was shattering. Inside, Jason pulled out 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil. He handed one to Marcus, who nodded, but placed it on the table untouched. Jason took a few bites, before pausing. His face looked tired, not from the weight of his small frame, but from the weight of understanding too much, too soon. Eleanor turned away briefly, struggling to compose herself. Her company sent leftover catered meals to landfills. Offices were lined with imported artwork and custom chairs. Bonuses were distributed at year-end parties, without a thought for the ones who stayed late to clean up afterward. Her breath caught when she looked back and saw Marcus reach for his sandwich, only to quietly split it and hand half to Jason without a word. The boy accepted it, no complaint, no protest. It was ordinary to them, a routine they had practiced far too often. She leaned against a lamppost, overwhelmed by a feeling she did not quite recognize. Guilt, certainly, but something deeper. She had built a business on innovation and progress, yet never paused to examine what was happening below the surface. People like Marcus had always remained invisible, not because they lacked value, but because nobody bothered to look. A noise from the house drew her attention again. Marcus was now sitting on a folding chair, rubbing his temples. Jason carefully poured water into two mismatched cups, placing one in front of him like it was tea in a fine china set. Eleanor's eyes stung. There was grace in that boy's gesture. In this fragile, forgotten space, kindness still lived. She stepped away before either of them noticed her. Walking back to her car, her heels felt heavier than usual. The city lights seemed colder. The silence inside her vehicle was deafening. As she drove back toward her apartment, the dashboard clock blinked midnight. But she knew sleep would not come easily, because tonight she had seen something that could never be unseen. Morning arrived behind a sheet of gray clouds, casting a dull tone over the skyline. Eleanor stared out the window of her corner office, her reflection barely visible in the glass. The coffee on her desk had gone cold, untouched since it was placed there an hour earlier. Her inbox overflowed, the usual chaos waiting. But none of it mattered. Her thoughts were still in that dim little room from the night before. Her executive team gathered in the conference room across the hall. The quarterly report was due. Presentations had been polished, numbers carefully aligned, forecasts arranged like trophies. Eleanor stepped inside without greeting anyone, eyes colder than usual, her silence unnerving. She took her seat at the head of the table, leaned back slightly, and folded her hands. "Before we start," she said, her voice sharper than glass, "I need answers." The room tensed. The head of operations shifted in his chair. "Of course. About the projections?" "No," Eleanor interrupted. "About our janitorial staff." Several brows furrowed. Murmurs floated between confused executives. She continued before anyone could respond. "How are they paid? What benefits do they receive? How many are directly employed versus contracted?" The HR director fumbled with her tablet. "Most of the cleaning crew are through a third-party vendor. We negotiated a bulk rate. It's standard practice." "What does that mean in real numbers?" "Minimum wage," she admitted. "No health care, no paid time off." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "And how often do we evaluate their conditions?" Silence. "No evaluations?" she pressed. "They're not company employees," someone said carefully. "We're not obligated." Her eyes narrowed. "Not obligated. Interesting. A junior." Executive tried to deflect. "If there's been a complaint, we can escalate it to the vendor." "There was no complaint," Eleanor snapped. "That's the point. There never is." An awkward pause followed. Fingers tapped nervously against tablet screens. Several avoided her gaze. She stood slowly, letting the weight of her presence fill the room. "Last night," she began, "I followed one of our night janitors home. Marcus Hill. He's worked here for over 15 years. He cleans the floors you all walk on every morning without ever acknowledging the man behind the mop." No one spoke. She walked to the window and stared out, her voice quieter but harder. "Susan lives in a place I would not let my dog sleep. He's raising his grandson in a broken apartment with no heat, no comfort, and barely enough food to survive. And yet he arrives here every night, early and prepared, and works until the building shines. We celebrate innovation and success while ignoring the people who hold up the foundation." The finance lead leaned forward slightly. "We've always followed protocol. It's not a matter of, 'I don't care about protocol anymore,'" Eleanor interrupted, her tone final. "What I care about is whether this company is worth leading." Another silence filled the space. This one was heavier. She walked back to her seat, sat down again, and looked each person in the eye. "This isn't just about Marcus. It's about every person we've chosen not to see. Every employee who walks through our doors hoping for dignity and leaves with crumbs. The HR director cleared her throat. What do you want us to do? Eleanor didn't hesitate. Start by cutting ties with that third-party contractor. Bring the janitorial staff under our payroll. Full benefits, health care, retirement matching. Then I want an internal audit of every position earning below the city's living wage. Real numbers, not charts. I want their stories. One executive spoke cautiously. That would mean reallocating funds, bonuses, perhaps even cutting marketing spend? Then do it, she said, steel in her tone. Across the city, Marcus folded fresh towels on the armrest of the couch, while Jason lined up school books beside his mattress. Neither knew their quiet night had sparked a storm. By noon, Eleanor returned to her office to find a small envelope resting on her desk. No name, no handwriting, just a crude drawing taped to the front. Inside was a child's sketch in crayon, a tall building with smiling windows and stick figures holding hands at the bottom. In bright blue, someone had scribbled, "Someday I'll work here too." Her heart clenched. It had to be Jason. She stared at the drawing longer than she meant to. There was something innocent in those lines, something honest in the dream. He had no idea what she had seen, or that she had followed him. He simply believed in something better, and believed enough to return a gesture of hope. She framed it and placed it behind her desk, not as decoration, but as a reminder. Change did not begin in spreadsheets or shareholder letters. Sometimes it began with a quiet boy who waited without complaint, and a man who had been invisible for far too long. The air felt different as Eleanor walked through the lobby the next morning. The marble floor gleamed as always, but for the first time she noticed the hands that made it shine. A soft buzz of movement followed her as employees arrived, unaware that something fundamental had shifted overnight. She bypassed her usual elevator and took the stairs. Every floor she passed, she nodded at someone she had never greeted before. A maintenance worker fixing a vent, a woman restocking the break room, a man emptying the recycling bin. Each look they gave her was a mixture of surprise and disbelief. At her desk, she opened the company-wide email draft she had prepared at 3 a.m. Words had come to her easily then, written not from a place of duty, but responsibility. She added one final sentence before hitting send. Across the building, computers pinged. By noon, the janitorial staff stood in the main conference room. Confused, some still in uniform, others holding their brooms and gloves. Eleanor stood at the front, alongside the new director of employee equity, a role created just this morning. No reporters, no cameras, no PR spin, she addressed them directly. You have cleaned our offices, scrubbed our floors, emptied our trash, and polished our spaces without ever asking for more than what you were promised. And for too long, we offered far too little. The room was silent. But starting today, you are no longer contracted labor. You are part of us, this company, this future. You will receive full wages, proper health care, sick leave, retirement plans, and, most importantly, respect. A few heads lifted. If anyone has questions, we will answer them. If you have concerns, we will listen. And if you need support, it will be given. One woman blinked rapidly, her fingers trembling at her sides. A man in the back adjusted his glasses, but said nothing. Eleanor's voice remained calm. This is not a favor. It's justice delayed, and we're done delaying. Afterward, several workers stayed behind, One shook her hand quietly and whispered, "Thank you. I thought we'd never be seen." Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited Marcus's building, this time in daylight. Her black car stood out on the street, but she no longer cared about appearances. She carried 2 bags, one with groceries, the other with something more permanent. Jason answered the door, eyes wide. "It's you," she smiled. "Is your grandfather home?" Marcus appeared behind him, confusion in his expression. He looked older than she remembered, wearier, but somehow more grounded. "I didn't expect this," he said. "No one did," she replied gently. "But it's long overdue." She placed the groceries on the kitchen counter and handed Marcus a sealed envelope. Inside was a formal offer, salary, benefits, and a full-time supervisory role with flexible hours. A promotion, a fresh start. Jason peeked over his grandfather's arm, reading the large letters across the top. His mouth opened slightly. "You're hiring him?" Eleanor nodded. "Not just hiring, elevating." Marcus looked stunned. "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because someone should have a long time ago. Because you stayed. Because you gave everything. And because we finally stopped looking past you." He sat down heavily on the folding chair, staring at the document in silence. Jason leaned into his side, a proud smile on his face. "There's something else," Eleanor added, reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small card with an embossed logo. "This is for Jason," she said, handing it over. "It's a scholarship voucher. It guarantees full tuition at any local preparatory academy of his choice." Marcus's hand rose to his mouth. Jason held the card like it was made of gold. "I don't know what to say," Marcus whispered. "Say you'll accept," she replied softly. He nodded once, slowly, still trying to process it. Outside, the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a faint glow over the sidewalk. Eleanor stood for a moment, taking in the peeling paint, the crooked door frame, the sagging roof. Then she turned back to Jason. "You said you wanted to work in that building someday," he grinned. "I still do." "Well," she said with a smile, "you're already closer than most people ever get." She returned to her office with a lighter step. The drawing Jason made still hung behind her desk. That evening, she stared at it once more and saw something new, possibility in every color. Weeks passed. The energy in the building shifted. Employees greeted the cleaning staff by name. Posters went up in break rooms, reminding everyone that every role mattered. Department heads began showing up to night shifts just to listen. No initiative, no speech, just presence. Eleanor no longer felt like a figure behind glass. She was walking the halls, sitting beside interns, asking questions she had ignored for years. Change had not come with noise. It had arrived with one silent boy waiting in a lobby, holding a paper bag, and everything after that had followed.